This video will be looking at higher close reading revision, and in particular it will focus on the final question, which is the question on both passages. Firstly, it's important to understand the skills that are required to answer this question. Basically, you're being asked to read passage 1 and passage 2, and firstly to understand the key ideas and be able to summarise those key ideas in your own words. This question is also about comparison, so you need to understand the relationship between these texts and to what extent they agree or disagree. And lastly, you're being asked to support any points you make with textual evidence. Now we'll take a look at some higher past paper questions. All three questions on the slide are taken from higher close reading papers. The first thing to note is that the words highlighted in yellow are similar across all 3 years. So this is something to note, that this question and the way it's worded never really changes. Secondly, it's always worth 5 marks. Another thing to note is that something that will change is whether or not you're being asked to compare these passages in terms of their areas of agreement or their areas of disagreement. So this will be specified in the question for you. A common mistake is for pupils to answer on areas in which they agree, where the questions in fact asks for you to look at areas in which they disagree. So our first key tip is to read the question very closely and ensure you're doing exactly what the question specifies. Before we begin answering these types of questions, we need to ensure that we have a clear understanding of the marking scheme. Now, the slide in front of you is taken from an SQA marking scheme for the last question. The section highlighted in red is the most important part because it breaks down how you go from 0 marks to 5 marks. Now, we can see that it says that 0 marks is obviously if you fail to identify any key areas of agreement. For 1 mark, you need to identify 1 key area of agreement. For 2 marks, you need to identify 2 key areas of agreement. And for 3 marks, you need to identify 3 key areas of agreement. Thereafter, to get 4 or 5 marks, you still only require to identify 3 key areas of agreement. However, you need to include appropriate supporting evidence for 4 marks, or else detailed and insightful use of supporting evidence for 5 marks. Now we'll have a go of a worked example, and through this I'll teach you how to structure your answer for the last question. Pause now to take a moment to read through the past paper question in front of you. If I was in the exam, the first thing I would do is highlight the word agree, so that as I'm reading through the passage I have this focus of looking for clear areas of agreement. To begin your answer, you should write 3 subheadings which clearly state the ways in which the writers agree. Here's an example. Now, so far I will only have gained 1 mark, and as we previously said in the marking scheme, in order to get 3 marks, you need to identify 3 key areas of agreement. So here are my 3 subheadings, which each identify ways in which passage 1 and passage 2 agree. At this stage, you will have achieved 3 marks because you've identified 3 key areas of agreement. However, in order to attain 4 or 5 marks, we need to do a bit more because, as specified in the marking guide, we need to use supporting evidence to support these points. To do this, there's a very specific way of laying out our answer, and it is that under each subheading you must write 2 bullet points, 1 for each passage. Each bullet point should take a passage in turn and explain in more specific detail the key point being made by the writer. This point should also be supported with textual evidence. Now we'll apply this to a worked example. As you can see at the top of the page, I have written my first subheading. Under this, I need to write my first bullet point. As already stated, this bullet point needs to deal with the first passage. It must include a quotation from that text, and then I go on to explain the quotation and what it shows about the writer's point. You should repeat these steps, but now dealing with passage 2. If you take a moment to read through my second bullet point, you'll see that I've dealt with passage 2, I've included a relevant quotation, and then I go on to explain that. So this is what your first key point should look like. You need to repeat these steps twice more so that under each of your 3 subheadings you have these 2 bullet points in order to gain a full 5 marks. Again, you can see in my second example that I've got a clear subheading. I've written my first bullet point, which deals with the first passage, and then my second bullet point explaining the idea explored in the second passage. Now we have our third key argument, so again it's the subheading I'd already written and my 2 bullet points which clearly deal with the 2 passages separately. When you're first learning how to approach this question, it can feel as though you're having to do an awful lot at once. However, once you get to grips with the marking scheme and the structure, it will begin to feel fairly straightforward. So to simplify it, all we're really being asked to do is to write 3 subheadings which clearly state the area of agreement or disagreement. Under each subheading, write 2 bullet points, one for each passage exploring that writer's opinion on the specific topic, and lastly, backing up each of these points with close reference to the text or quotation.